Welcome to the Power of Music podcast, brought to you by JM International. Get ready to explore conversations with those making a difference through music.
Hello, and welcome to the Power of Music podcast, brought to you by JMI, Jeunesse Musicale International, the global network of NGOs that empowers young people through music across all boundaries. In this episode, we're honored to be joined by Laura Hassler, founder and director of Musicians Without Borders, a global leader in using music for social change. For over 25 years, Musicians Without Borders has worked with people in communities affected by war, conflict, and displacement, bringing the healing and unifying power of music to some of the most divided places on earth. Today, we explore how music not only connects us, but also plays a pivotal role in nonviolent movements and peacebuilding. Laura shares her inspiring journey from introducing music as a tool for social change in post-conflict regions to her experience with activism, including her involvement in recent protests for Extinction Rebellion. We delve into the intersectionality of the challenges we face and how singing a song from someone's homeland can quite literally cross borders. As always, if you enjoy our content, don't forget to subscribe, like, and rate the podcast. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Thank you so much for joining us today. Can you tell us first a little bit about your journey and the start of Musicians Without Borders?
Sure. I'll try to make it brief because it's been quite a long journey. I grew up in the US, outside of New York City. My parents were both professionally active in the international peace movement, peace and nonviolence movement, and they were also both amateur musicians and lovers of music. My father used to sing at weddings. My mother could harmonize with any melody and was always doing that everywhere. And, I said at some point, I think that if they had grown up in a different time, they might have both become professional musicians for their love of music, but they grew up during a depression and then during the beginning parts of the Second World War. And they were both people of high principles, and that's the way their life led. But after the war, they, together with two other couples, started a cooperative living community. And that's where I grew up. And this was in the countryside then. Now it's suburbs, but it was countryside north of New York City. And we were finally 45 families. And it was a cooperative. It was a nonprofit cooperative. And it attracted very interesting people, both people who were active in many social causes, from the freedom movements in Africa and Latin America, to civil rights movements in the US, to peace activism. It also attracted artists and musicians and free spirits, many. And there was a kind of atmosphere. There were both classical musicians and there were people who played guitar and sang folk songs. And as children, we grew up with all of that music happening around us, and also with free music lessons from our neighbors and with wonderful events and concerts. And, it was also a period when nobody had money and young families raising their children and sharing and growing. So I grew up in that whole sort of combination of engagement with the world and exposure to the arts, and then especially to music and loving music. I was the one who led the singing on the school bus every day, an hour each way, with all of the children. And we always sang in harmony because that's what we always did. And then, later in school, free clarinet lessons, and from my neighbor, piano lessons. And then I was the accompanist to the choir, and you're just involved in all of these wonderful projects. And at the same time, my father worked with Martin Luther King. And so I was very aware of that movement, but also of the power of singing in that movement and of music. And my father also told stories from some of his heroes from the Second World War, like, for example, a Huguenot pastor and his wife in a town in central France who organized their entire village to hide and smuggle out Jewish children and other refugees during the Second World War, and who used music, singing of their Huguenot hymns at various moments to signal to each other when it was safe to go somewhere or when somebody else was coming. And then this wonderful story of when he was finally arrested by the Vichy police of the entire village lining up in 2 rows along the path from the church and singing the Huguenot hymn as he was being led off to jail. So all of these, it was always a kind of natural mix for me. The power of music to engage, to express, to build courage, to speak the truth, as it were, and also just the beauty of it. And so this was the environment that I grew up in. And I've often said that, I've sort of my whole life, I've stood on one foot or the other, either the activism or the music, and Musicians Without Borders brought those two together.
That's wonderful. And as you may know, Jeunesse Musicale was also born out of the resistance in the Second World War, showcasing that
yes.
power. What would you say is now, in the last years in your life, are they always hand in hand, the music and the activist, or have you become more of an activist?
Well, when I was just out of college, out of university, I was an activist in the streets and getting arrested. And this was also during the time of the Vietnam War, protesting that. But I was usually the one leading the singing, with our groups. So in that sense, I was more of an activist now. After I moved to the Netherlands, which was a long time ago, I went, you could say I went back to my music, and I developed a music career. And then it was more, sort of, I would say, soft activism. So we would perform, like I had a chamber choir, and we performed the Canto General by Theodorakis, which was really an expression of the sense of liberation in Latin America. And we performed an oratorium, an Armenian oratorium on the anniversary of the Armenian genocide. And I did protest songs with my groups, and I set up a multicultural women's choir to create a place of welcome through music for women in the Netherlands who had come from other countries, and to sort of try to shift the narrative where there was a lot of prejudice and isolation, and there still is, but not so much by going out on the streets with a sign, but by working with this beautiful group of women. I led this choir for 20 years, and when I stopped, we were 28 women from 21 different cultures, singing each other's songs, and then putting that on a stage and performing for people in the Netherlands. So it was like that kind of, I set up what we then called a world music school in the city where I live, which became an integral part of the regular music school. But it opened up sort of the exposure to music from other cultures as well. So it was that kind of work. And I think as it happened, one of the groups I led was an a cappella women's ensemble, and we sang music from different cultures. And one of the kinds of music that I loved was folk music from the Balkans, also because of the ways that women use their voices in singing folk music. It's outdoor music. It's full-throated, full-chested music, and because of the ways that you hear sort of East meeting West in those genres as well, and my fascination for these complicated rhythms, asymmetrical rhythms, you could say, non-Western rhythms with harmonies, for example, in many of these songs. I loved that. And so we were singing a lot of songs from the Balkans since like the 80s. And then you get the Balkan Wars in the 90s. And suddenly it felt really weird to be singing songs from Bosnia, And at a certain point, I was asked by the city I live in to perform a memorial concert, the annual Dutch 4th of May memorial concert for victims of the Second World War, but that's sort of expanded to look at war more generally. And so we performed a concert. Instead of a Mozart requiem, we did folk songs from the Balkans, and sort of put these songs next to each other, basically just saying with music that ordinary people everywhere sing lullabies and love songs. And something about the grief and the pity of war, and that came across very clearly. And it suddenly sort of sparked an idea to see whether we could, as musicians, also contribute to peace building and to reconciliation and to helping to heal some of the wounds of war. And so there I found my old activism coming back and meeting the music. And that's been the story of my life for the last 25 years.
So can you then tell a little bit about how that then led to the inception, so to speak, of Musicians Without Borders?
Yeah, well, it was just basically after that concert, one of the musicians said something like, we should really start putting this music on trains and buses and sending it out places and, connecting with people. And that sparked an idea. And I went back to the people who worked for the International Peace Organization that my parents had both worked for, and presented this idea, which was still very vague, but, music connects, and couldn't we work together? And to my surprise, the director at that point of that peace organization was an amateur cellist. And she said, wow, that's interesting. So we got free office space, and we were just all volunteers, but within a couple of months, we were renting buses. We did a big benefit marathon concert, raised some money, rented some buses all summer, and went out to the refugee camps where people from Kosovo were being sheltered in the Netherlands. Then there were about 6,000 people who were temporarily here. And within another 3 or 4 months, we were in Bosnia with a group. We'd been invited to perform for the opening of a children's after-school program. And we found our way to a refugee camp where people were living in tents. And we had a couple of amazing musicians with us who were very skilled at nonverbal communication, nonverbal music leadership, and at, I would say, being so much fun and so engaging that they could tempt any child anywhere to join in a circle and make music together. And that's kind of how it started, and then we had a couple of years of meeting musicians in the Balkans who were, of course, interested in connecting with us, and exchanges. And, as we've learned over the years, one of the big disasters for people during and following a war is being isolated and kind of being reduced to that one piece of your identity, which has to do with what happened in the war. So there was this. Everywhere we went, we met musicians who said, yes, we want to join. Yes, please. And so we did a number of sort of exchanges, my groups or sort of ad hoc groups based around my groups, traveling to Macedonia, to Kosovo, to Bosnia, meeting up with musicians there, being invited to perform at festivals, brought out to refugee camps to do music with children. We brought some musicians to the Netherlands, and we did tours together here. So there were these kind of exchanges for a while. And then we kind of realized, well, these were always wonderful for the musicians who participated, but when they were over, it was over. So were there possibilities to do something that was longer term? And just in this time, we came into contact with a group that was working from the Netherlands in Srebrenica in Bosnia to try to help rebuild and restore there out of a feeling of responsibility, because it had been Dutch UN troops who had basically abandoned people there. And this young woman was a music teacher, and we, together with another organization, raised enough money for her to buy a secondhand van. And she ended up living there for 3 or 4 years, learning the language, and her van became the music bus. And that was our first long-term project. So she would, in this, by that time, ethnically separated region where people of different ethnicities did not live together anymore, the music bus would travel to different communities and bring music to children who didn't have any music in their lives, and brought in a number of local musicians and dancers and theater people. And then would, once there was some trust gained among local people and parents and teachers, and so they'd organize like a weekend doing percussion together and bringing kids from these different communities together, and then bring the parents in to watch them performing together. Or a summer camp where half of the children were of one ethnic group and the other half of another, but you're only making music. And so, and this became, in this we've always sort of learned by doing. So our first training manual we produced after the training had taken place, thinking, oh, we should actually document this, and so things grew, but it was really about collaborating with local musicians, trying to be as demand driven as we could at that point, having some ideas and working together with local organizations so that we could help to bring this power of music to places where it was so very needed.
And I'm wondering, did you feel that in these times, initiatives like these were welcomed by, let's say, national authorities, local authorities, and the bus traveling around, or was there some pushback?
No, there was never really any pushback, and I think that's for a couple of things. One of these things is that parents of all children, no matter what their background, they want their children to have a good life, and they want their children to have beautiful experiences. And making music with children is it touches people. It touches the parents, it touches the kids, it touches the people who are doing it. And that's also something that we've noticed across the years, even when we get into much more tricky situations. Like, for example, the rock school that we've been running, we haven't been running it, but we set it up. It's now an independent rock school in Kosovo with very strict ethnic divides. But because you're making music, it kind of flies under the radar. And I think also, and this is something that we've learned over the years, is that sometimes even when authorities start out being hostile or non-cooperative, at least on the small scale, that you can quite quickly impact their own reactions to you by making music. I've literally sung ourselves across borders in the early years a couple of times when there were guards who didn't want to let us through, and we happened to know a beautiful song from their region and, got out of the bus at the border and sang it. And then you see people wiping their tears away and going, oh, welcome to Croatia. So, this is, and that's just a very small sort of personal memory. But I think that, people recognize the importance of music especially for their young people, but also for their communities. And even though, to my mind, we're doing something very political, you could say, very, very much aimed at building something that will lead to social change, that will lead to much more inclusive community. But, for local officials, it's just kids making music. So what's wrong with that?
Yeah, there is something almost harmless about music, even though it's one of the most powerful things that we have.
Yeah. And doesn't that also say something about the fact that every human being has music in them and the appreciation for music? And even people who say, I'm not musical, they walk, they have a heartbeat, they are often touched by music when they hear it. The fact that so much of music education has been built up in such a way that it tends to teach people that they can't be musical, at least in Western societies, in societies where that isn't taught, everybody makes music for everything, for weddings, for grieving, for love, for putting children to sleep, And I think that when you acknowledge that doesn't say that nobody should study music. Of course, great. If you want to be virtuoso at playing an instrument or at singing, wonderful. And people can be made very happy by listening to you. But that's not the essence of music. The essence of music is that everybody has it in them, and that this is as strong or stronger than language, as also many scientists and researchers are starting to discover.
So how has led this beautiful insight? And then I know you're also, if I'm correct, celebrating 25 years of Musicians Without Borders. How is this then developed in this sort of, you kind of did things on the fly, ad hoc, implemented stuff because it felt good. And I know it's still going strong. How has this impacted the mission today and what you're doing globally nowadays?
That's a really good question because, of course, when we started, as you said, it was on the fly and it was very much kind of organic, what came our way, what we were able to imagine. I still remember traveling through the Balkans with everybody with pockets full of cash, because that was what we did. And you could never do that anymore. And over the years also, as we've grown, and of course we've made some mistakes, but, luckily none that really destroyed us which could have happened. But we've also grown in appreciation for the need to establish structures and various things that safeguard both the people you're working with and your own staff. I think that some of the original impetus and inspiration is still there. And then I would name things like the respect for partners in other areas, the fact that we don't have a kind of copy-paste approach to work. It's much more a question of demand-driven. So being invited and listening to what the need is, and then assessing whether a partnership might be possible, and then working together with the party that's requested that. And of course, checking out, do we share basic values? I mean, we say, well, we believe and we understand, as musicians, we understand the power of music to connect but we also understand that music has been used exactly because of that power, also for violent and negative goals, including in some of the places where we work. I mean, think of Rwanda, where songs were created that encouraged genocide in the 90s. Or think of the Balkans, where a whole genre of music was created to divide people and produce hate and aggression. So we also look to the principles of nonviolence, which include do no harm, which include solidarity with people who are oppressed, which include equality. We look to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, alas, many Western governments are ignoring these days, but we take them seriously. And I think of those as kind of, you could say, a conscience, so you check back. And we've created a theory of change, how we think change happens with people who engage in music, who enter into music activities from a background or a history or a perspective in which damage around them has occurred, possibly traumatic events, possibly impact of themselves, and how we think that music making can impact that. So we've developed many, many tools over the years. I think what we have kept very much is this sense of co-collaboration, of not being a humanitarian organization, of not going in with the idea of, well, we're coming from the wise, rich part of the world, mostly white part of the world, to bring help to poor people who can't manage. No, we see ourselves as building a network of musicians across the world who are opposed to war and who are working for social change and for peace building. And when I was in peace movements, social change movements, one part of that was going out and demonstrating with signs, which is still part of activism. But another part was what we called community building. And I think a lot of our projects are like that. Therefore they're also usually long-term, which that originally Music Bus program it lasted for like 10 years and resulted in creating a children's music theater in Srebrenica. So there were, it's this idea that you collaborate, you do the kind of slow and trust building work, and that also is often very difficult to fund, for example, because most donors want quick results and don't want to be connected to long-term obligations. But I think it's this kind of believing in these processes which are really working towards both social change and solidarity and connection across borders or without borders, if possible.
Could you share a little bit about the theory of change that you mentioned, both as a concept, because I am really glad that I see a lot of NGOs and organizations picking this up to kind of structure their work, but I'm not sure every organization uses this as a concept or even knows what it is, and maybe also more about the specific theory of change for the Musicians Without Borders.
Yeah, well, I can also send it to you, which you could attach in the notes.
Sure.
But basically we have isolated, or we have defined for sort of overall a number of principles around which we work and which we check back on as we're working. And those 5 principles, if I can recall them all in the right order, is safety is number 1, inclusion is number 2, equality is number 3, creativity, and quality. Yeah. And so measuring what you do along those kinds of principles, and then we have theorized, and also, but actually, like I said, almost everything we've written has been written down retroactively, having already learned stuff and then thinking we need to write this down so that we can share it. Well, how does that work? How do those principles work? And what do those principles achieve when you're talking about using music with, what does the power of music do? How can you use the power of music? So, for example, if you're thinking about safety, imagine children in a standard traditional music classroom, of which I've seen many, where the music lesson is the teacher standing in the front of the class and telling the students what they're supposed to learn and writing on a board, and maybe the children who can sing better are on the front row, and the ones who are sort of singing out of tune get put at the back or get told that, okay, so to us, this is a very unsafe way of working with children with music. And a safer way is almost always working in the form of a circle, setting up musical games where a child can introduce themselves and every child will respond by a child sings their name and other children sing the name back to them. And also respecting a child's possible wish not to participate and honoring them anyway. And so there are a lot of that kind of responses to situations where children don't feel safe. Inclusion, I'm thinking about, for example, one of our projects in Palestine where 50 children have instrumental lessons that includes some children with special needs, and they all play in the same orchestra. And the way that that's been developed is that our program manager there, who is a wonderful cellist, she makes arrangements so that a child who can only play one note only has to play one note, and also has set up a system so that the older children in the orchestra help to coach the younger ones, or the ones with more experience help to coach. So you get this kind of collective working towards, you could say, the best quality that each one can produce, and praising that rather than kind of an artificial, arbitrary judgment about what and there you come to the quality element. So it's different in every project, but those are sort of the general principles. And that's really an idea about how music works on the individual level. And we're now talking about, well, how can we succinctly describe how we think music also works in the collective, in the community level. And that one's not finished yet. But like I said, we sort of do these things retroactively. So we look at, well, what has worked and what hasn't worked, and how can we sort of move ahead with these things that we learn gradually from how things work, and how you see, and that also means that we have systems for trying to measure that, trying to get reactions from participants, to see what they say, to give them space, to give them word. Also, going back to your earlier question, something I wanted to say but forgot to say is that I think that one of the things that we have, despite all of this kind of, policy development and structures and methodologies, and they're all there, but I think what we've held on to is you could say, maybe artistic way of thinking. I would put it that way. So that creativity is not only part of when you sit down with your guitar or to sing or to play drums or in a band, but also in how you think about things, in how you get an idea and move with the idea. And one of my favorite philosophers is a man called John Paul Lederach. And he's actually somebody he's been a professor of peacebuilding. That's actually a field. But he's also been a participant in negotiations that have ended a number of wars. And one of the things that he says about professional peace builders, which are people who negotiate and people who try to find ends to conflicts and so forth, is that they need to think more like artists. Because artists are always expecting the unexpected and working with the unexpected. And to me, that's one of the things that, even though, we're 25 years down the road and we've become a much more professional organization, I think we've held on to that creativity. And also in the way of thinking, the way of engaging with the world. To me, that's something precious.
Yeah, I can imagine. I was actually having this exact conversation yesterday with someone about where we had a meeting about the challenges related to the environment, quite a big meeting. And some people said we need more artists that actually can think outside the box and come up with things that maybe are not imaginable for the non-creative minds.
Yeah, exactly. Or to find ways of stimulating that creativity.
Exactly.
Because like music, I think everybody has creativity in them. It's just that so many of our systems are basically structured to stamp that out, and so finding it again is also a very interesting challenge.
Exactly. Speaking about the environment, I know that you also ended up in a protest for Extinction Rebellion and even became, I think you said, a spokesperson. Can you say a little bit about that, or how did that happen?
Sure. Well, Extinction Rebellion, as probably everybody listening knows, is an activist group focused on climate disaster, and among other forms of activism, also engages in nonviolent civil disobedience. So in the Netherlands, where I live, that has mainly been in the form of blocking a highway in the capital, The Hague, on Saturdays, I believe, mainly, but maybe through the weeks regularly, in order to protest the fact that the Dutch government subsidizes the fossil fuel industry to the tune of, I believe, something like 46 billion a year. Counter to their statements and policy decisions, by the way, which had promised to phase this out, but they still do it. So this is a demand for them to stop, and they've used this form of civil disobedience. And a couple of years ago, when there was a demonstration planned, the Dutch police actually raided the homes of a number of Extinction Rebellion activists in the night, I believe, and arrested people, not for even doing this, but for posting on social media about it to urge people to come to this nonviolent demonstration. And in response to that, a number of larger organizations like Greenpeace, Amnesty, Oxfam got together and set up a protest forum for the right to protest. It's called the Right to Protest Only. And I was invited to sign that petition because I'm also a director of an NGO. And I did. And then somebody posted in this shared app that we had, and if you can come to the demonstration just to support it, not to sit down on the highway, but just as a support demonstration, please do. And I did. I went fully in the expectation that, there would be 10 XR activists sitting on the highway and getting arrested, and we would be standing with 20 of us up on the highway above with a sign saying, "We support you." To my amazement, there were 1,000 demonstrations, and we were with 2,000 people supporting them. And I found it very inspiring, the whole spirit of it, the ways in which the demonstrators, also the ones who were doing civil disobedience and being arrested, it reminded me of the civil rights movement and of our own movements against the Vietnam War from the nonviolent peace movement, of really whole attitude of nonviolence, non-cooperation, but no hostility towards the police, towards each other, of caring for each other, of being willing to accept the consequences of your civil disobedience. I was very moved by that. And so I went again, and then I went again. And meanwhile, I was in this group, and Musicians Without Borders, we signed these petitions as well. So we became part of this movement for the right to protest, but also then in support of Extinction Rebellion. And then at a certain point, I was invited to be one of the speakers at a big demonstration, also in support of, in The Hague. And so I did. I spoke, and I spoke about this connective link of nonviolence and the understanding of that many musicians have of the power of music to also to communicate in these kinds of situations. And I was also I thought this was so beautiful that one of these demonstrations, there was a group of classical musicians who came and they played the Dies Irae of Mozart, or a piece of it, on the highway as well. Orchestral people and a choir as well. And then when they came back a couple of weeks later to do the same thing, the police forbade them from taking their instruments onto the street and threatened with taking their instruments from them. And what did they do? They went up on the street without their instruments, and the whole orchestra sang their parts, and the choir sang their part. And this is amazing, and here you are then as classical musicians saying, we are expressing our dismay about government policy towards the climate, which affects us all. And we're doing that through the power of music, which is what we do, which I think, this is amazing. I think this is wonderful. So, and I see this all in the context of the relationships between the interconnections, between the major issues that challenge us these days. They're all connected. So yeah, I'm not going to sit on the road, at least not yet. But and then I wrote a couple of blog pieces about the connections between these issues for our own website. And there was a kind of a dialogue. And now we have, not as a result of that necessarily, but we now have a collaboration actually with an environmental organization and a new project in DRC Congo, that brings together music and climate and conflict in one project.
Can you share a bit about that specific project in the DRC and how this sort of intersectionality is addressed there?
Sure. It's a new project, so it's sort of in the early phases. The idea behind it, our team in Rwanda, amazing Rwandan musicians, they, at their initiative also, and we supported that, for 2 years, they were involved in training Congolese musicians with skills so that they could work in refugee camps, of which there are many, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people now displaced in Congo. So going into refugee camps and being able to make music with children, make the children happy, etc. So we developed this relationship with a Congolese organization that sponsors that, or that organizes it. And meanwhile, in the same region, there was a project being supported by IUCN, which is an international climate organization, which has, among others, an office in Amsterdam. And IUCN was supporting a Congolese organization that was working through theater to train young people as climate activists, or to be aware of the climate in their region. Now, the conflict in Congo, the many conflicts, but it brings everything together, because you have, as everybody knows, a lot of violence, a lot of armed groups fighting for each other. What are they fighting for each other? Access to resources. Where are the resources? In the ground. And what's happening is child labor and slave labor and international corporations and arming international partners wanting to get at those resources, like, for example, the minerals that are needed to make our iPhones, cobalt, lithium, et cetera, et cetera. And meanwhile, the climate is also, there's a climate disaster as partially a consequence of this. And then you have like international climate organizations interested in, well, how can we help? Now, as it happens, people who live in these regions know a great deal about how to care for the land. And how is that knowledge passed? Not by writing papers. It's passed through song. So this project we've been working with a number of these young people, both the musicians and the theater-trained climate activists. to be able to collect songs from the elders about how to live in peace with the land. So they collect them, they learn them, and then they teach them to the children in the projects where they're working with children. So it's just starting this, but I find this has grown naturally, and also a bit like I said earlier, by, what you meet where you are. We didn't know we were going to meet people who were working with young people on climate through theater. But when you do, and you see an opening, and you know that there's an organization that's behind that, and you could reach out to them, and things gradually come together. So I find this, a very beautiful and natural project. And, we have also one in Jordan where, sort of similarly, we're working with a Jordanian organization set up by a woman singer whose idea it was to work in the most underserved regions of Jordan, the poorest areas, where children have no access to music. And what they do is a couple of musicians learn the songs from the old people, from the grandparents, and teach them to the children, and create children's choirs and put them on the stage in the community. So you're also, it's different, but it's also you're using this elder wisdom and the richness of traditions, which otherwise will be lost. So conserving these songs, passing them on to the young people, and using this as a way of connecting generations.
Wonderful. Beautiful. So it's an intergenerational, intersectional approach to everything that music could do.
Absolutely.
Maybe in these 25 years, what would you say were the biggest challenges for the organization, and how did you deal with that? And maybe also some of the current challenges related to speaking freely about certain topics.
Yeah. Well, I would say that, over the years, the biggest challenge, and this is maybe stupid to say it like that, but the biggest challenge is always finding the money to support the projects, because they all cost money. And the donor landscape, as you could say, the sources of funding that we've always relied on have always been funds and foundations, churches, musicians doing benefit concerts and so forth. But very many of the sources of funding for nonprofit organizations are geared for short-term projects. And like I said earlier, we work long-term. So that becomes difficult to sustain, also because, I mentioned John Paul Lederach earlier, the one who wrote about the need for artistic thinking in peacebuilding. But he also speaks about the longevity of conflict, that very often a conflict, you might, even when you get sort of the guns stop firing and then politicians declare peace, but maybe the conflict goes underground, and maybe it surfaces, some years later. And we've seen this in our project, for example, in Kosovo, in this ethnically divided city, where for a number of years you could really, think about a post-conflict environment. And then suddenly, a couple of years ago, the tensions became much worse because of the political developments, because of the actions, because also some of the core issues have never really been dealt with. And so then you have to backtrack, because, of course, you're careful about the safety of your participants, and maybe you can't do as many things as openly, or you can't do them with as much publicity. And so that's always been a major challenge, not ever having enough money to hire a fundraiser, or hardly ever. Now we do have a young, wonderful guy who's doing this, but that kind of stupid daily, what it takes to keep it going. And having chosen and having seen very many organizations with great success, who have lots of money, but don't engage in this kind of slow, patient work of social change, I would say, as much anyway, or not in the way that we do. And that's not to criticize. I mean, there's so much that's needed, but this is our way of doing it. And I think we've been persuaded by what we've seen, and by the results, and by what our partners have also shared, that this really works. but it's difficult to keep it going in that sense. So that's one thing. And as you mentioned, the question of censorship, that's now for the first time, because I've been speaking about Musicians Without Borders, also a lot of public speaking for all of these years, including for Jeunesse Musicale a number of times, which is lovely. And in all the years, it has only happened twice that I've been instructed ahead of time by the inviting organization what I should and what I should not talk about. And sorry about that. What in both of those cases, that's within the context of the current genocide happening in Palestine. So people didn't want me to talk about politics. They didn't want me to talk about what caused or who's doing or what's happening there. And I think you're now seeing a lot of. I found an interesting meme that said when the truth can no longer be hidden, then speaking the truth will be forbidden. And I think you're seeing a lot of that. And I'm sorry to say that it also impacts, very sympathetic organizations who are worried about their funding or they're worried about their relationships with others. And I think then we get back to the kind of the principles. And if I'm thinking about principles of nonviolence, on the one hand, I'm trying to do fundraising. On the other hand, I think you have to speak about the truth. And we've been working in Palestine since 2008. We have a beautiful program running there, still running, one of the very, very few, I think, where, children are able to make music in this project twice a week, unless we're forced to close the center or they're forced to close the center. But, the stress is unbelievable. It's very difficult for people to keep going. Also for our team is a lot of stress and a lot of trauma, and children come in with, stories and fears and worries. And so, I want to be able to talk about that. And I think this is something that when people look back on this era, I really believe this is the issue of our time, at least in the West, where in many ways I said something cynical about the Declaration of Human Rights, but in many ways the mask is off of what real power is. The mask is really off. And the role of my original country, the US, and my adopted country, the Netherlands, and the EU more broadly, and the United Kingdom, I think is shameful in this. And I think that, one of the things that we're asked to do as artists is to hold a mirror up and to speak truth. And so I try to navigate that.
What keeps you hopeful?
A couple of things. These days, I'm very hopeful about the younger generation, who seem to be quite more awake than my generation to the issues of our world and to the necessity of standing up and speaking openly. I'm also very moved by especially Jewish organizations in the US, Jewish Voice for Peace, and If Not Now, who are kind of leading a lot of this. I'm moved by the fact that a group like Extinction Rebellion reaches to the arts to express itself. I think another thing that gives me hope is just the knowledge that history can surprise us, and sometimes in a good way. And I remember, for example, when Nelson Mandela was sworn in as president of South Africa. I was driving home from somewhere. I remember sitting there with the tears rolling down my cheeks. But I also remember that, 5 years before that, nobody could have imagined that apartheid would end in South Africa. It seems so entrenched. And despite all of the cultural boycotts and actions and demonstrations, it seemed like it would never end. But it ended. It toppled. And so that kind of thing gives me hope. And I think also just, what could you say, the imperative. I mean, hope does not mean optimist. I'm not optimistic. I think hope is something stronger. And I think there's an imperative while there are people who are, and in our case, there are musicians who are working in much, much more difficult places than where I've ever had to be or work, or, I've visited places, but, they're, and others, they're surviving so many other things. So I find it almost a kind of compulsory hope, You must, because what is it? And because also, that if you don't act, you may not get the results that you're hoping for. But if we don't do anything, we know that everything will end terribly.
If people want to find out more about Musicians Without Borders, or even want to support, God forbid, and send some money, where can they find you, and how do they do that best?
Our website is at musicianswithoutborders.org. We are also in the Netherlands and also in the US. People can make tax-deductible donations. We're also trying to reach out to people in the music industry and corporate sponsors and supporters for partnerships. We're on social media, on Instagram and Facebook and LinkedIn, and we welcome people to join. We also have programs for monthly donors and that all of those things. And we put out a lot of information, and we're always really happy to hear from people.
As always, the very last question: what is the power of music?
Well, our motto, you could say, is war divides, music connects. And I think that says it all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for listening. If you want more information about JM, or you would like to get involved, visit www.jmi.net. At JMI, we are on a mission to make the world more musical. That's why we created Mubazar, a digital platform that helps us manage all our musical activities across 80 countries worldwide, connecting musicians with opportunities to grow both personally and professionally. If you are a music professional looking for a better way to manage and promote your music activities, check out Mubazar. Created for music organizers, by music organizers, Mubazar allows you to run music competitions, workshops, camps, auditions, masterclasses, awards, events, and much more. Mubazar offers custom application forms, payments for your activities, jury tools, translations, analytics, and more. Mubazar is fast becoming the best place for musicians to find and apply for music opportunities online, and you can sign up today for a free organizer account by going to www.mubazar.com, registering, and then requesting to upgrade to an organizer on the right-hand menu. For more info, don't hesitate to get in touch via support@mubazar.com. It would mean a lot to us if you could give us 1 minute of your time and rate and review the podcast. In case you have any suggestions or would like to be one of our next guests, feel free to reach out to us through the JMI socials.